the program that I'm using maxes out at 15 minutes, so I had to kind of start another one to finish up this piece that I was talking about. So continuing talking about the ethical principles, continuing again with the specifically protecting research participants, because there's so much that goes into that. The next thing to talk about in terms of how we protect our research participants is confidentiality and anonymity. So essentially, we are asking people to divulge this really personal information, so we have to take every precaution we possibly can to keep those identities confidential or anonymous if that's possible. Because if you are asking these people to give you personal information to what are probably perfect strangers, you have to ensure that you're going to protect that information that they're giving you. And so the difference between confidentiality and anonymity, confidentiality is kind of like the basic. That's like at least you want to be able to provide confidentiality. And this is basically, okay, so the researcher knows the subject's identity, and often it might be for a follow-up or, if there's a face-to-face or something like that. But the researcher is saying, well, I'm not going to reveal your identity to anybody that doesn't need to know, essentially. So nobody outside the research staff or the whoever's conducting the research. Whereas anonymity is just the identity is not known by anybody, including the researcher. So this is often the case in things like online surveys would be probably anonymous. If there's no reason to take the information, if you don't have to do follow-up and you don't have to see the person face-to-face, if you can make it anonymous, then that's the best way, because that protects them and the researcher. Because there are some situations where the standard of confidentiality doesn't apply. One of those is there are laws that allow the subpoena of research records, and sometimes it has to do with, for example, reporting child abuse. So if there is ongoing child abuse and there is a child currently in danger, there is actually a law that requires researchers to breach that confidentiality and provide that information. Also, a researcher may sometimes feel compelled to release information if there's a health or life-threatening situation that comes up, and that's kind of going to be at the researcher's discretion if you think somebody's life is in danger or that they could potentially be severely injured. That's something that you probably have an ethical duty to report that. That's probably more important to help that person and possibly save that person's life versus maintaining confidentiality of your participant. So sometimes you can have that breach that is justifiable. Also, sort of a separate situation where research doesn't require confidentiality or anonymity is if it's happening in public. If you are observing in a public space, let's say, or the information that the researcher is getting is available in public records, there's no need to maintain confidentiality or anonymity because everything is publicly available. Even if you are doing something like, on a street corner and you're watching cars go by and you want to see like how many people run red lights or something like that, anybody else could have been sitting at that corner at that same time. Just because there wasn't doesn't mean that there's any amount of confidentiality that's required. So, although, you probably aren't going to be writing down license plates or anything, but technically if anybody else was there, that's publicly available information. It's a public setting. So there is no requirement to maintain confidentiality if you are either using public records or you're doing some kind of observation in a public area. However, there is sort of this code of ethics that comes from ASC, which is the American Society of Criminology, and ACJS, which is the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences. And they say, there's a quote that says, confidential information provided by research participants must be treated as such by criminologists, even when this information enjoys no legal protection and legal force is applied. What that means is that sometimes there have been situations where researchers have been subpoenaed for their information once somebody finds out whatever they're interviewing people about or getting information about, and somebody wants that information. For example, there was research done, and this happened in Canada, and it was actually the basis for the Wigmore criteria that we now have there, which is sort of a separate ethical guidelines. But essentially, there was this guy, and it was actually at Simon Fraser University where I did my graduate degrees, although he was before me. But there was this guy, Russell Ogden, and he was conducting research, and it had something to do with, he was getting information about people who were helping other people end their lives, and so people who wanted to commit suicide, he was kind of he was talking to people who were helping people end other people's lives. And so because this was illegal, it became somebody heard about it, they got wind of it, the police heard about it, and they want to know. They're like, we want to know who's doing this because that's against the law, and we want to basically go arrest these people because if you're helping somebody commit suicide, that's a crime. And Russell Ogden was like, well, I was talking to these people and I told them I was going to maintain confidentiality, so no, I am not giving you their information. I'm not telling you who I'm talking to. And he literally, he was held by the court in contempt. He was put in jail for a certain amount of time. His research got pushed way back. It took him longer to end up getting his degree. But he's kind of like a hero to researchers because it's like one of those things where he was so worried about ethics. He was so concerned about his participants, and he didn't want to breach their privacy, and he didn't want to breach confidentiality. So he literally just would not give in. And so that's kind of what this sort of thing from the ASC and ACGS is kind of saying. They're not necessarily saying you have to go to jail, you have to go to that extent, but you should at least as a researcher know where your line is. And if you are not willing to protect so if you know that you're not going to protect your participants if you're subpoenaed for information, that's something you have to tell your participants if you think there's any chance of there being a subpoena. If you're asking about possibly criminal behavior, you have to know that you have to tell them, say, if I'm subpoenaed, I will give the information to whoever needs it or whatever, whoever's subpoenaing me. So you have to make that clear that if that's your line, that your research participants know that. So that's part of your ethical obligation. But this code of ethics basically says that even if legal force is being applied, you are being subpoenaed for information, you are actually still supposed to keep the confidentiality of your participants, because that is more important than basically complying with a subpoena. So, but you as a researcher, it would be a personal decision. You have to know where your line is and what you're willing to do for your participants, and you have to tell them in advance if there is a line that you won't cross to protect their confidentiality. Although, in terms of how we actually keep confidentiality, how do we do this? There's a lot of different ways that you can do this to help yourself as the researcher as well as your participants. And right off the bat, of course, you don't disclose identifying information to anybody else. That's of course, that's what confidentiality is. But also something that researchers often do is they anonymize their data. They can use pseudonyms, they can use coding schemes, but basically especially if you're using quantitative data, so you're getting information from a lot of different people, then if you anonymize that and then, you randomize it, and so there's no way you would actually be able to tie back who was who and who said what, then you actually can't give any more information, even if you're subpoenaed or something like that happens, or, even by accident, you can't release this information because it's all anonymized. There's no way to know who was who. It's a really great way to protect data, but obviously that has to be done after the fact. But it's a really great way to protect yourself as a researcher as well as your participants. And then when the research itself is being written up, especially within cases of qualitative data where you're maybe only doing a case study or talking to a small group of people, you want to write up the research so that your participants can't be identified based on what you're saying about them. So if you're like, well, I'm going to call this guy John Doe, but I'm going to basically say, all his demographics, like his age and his race and his ethnicity and any other thing, gender, everything that's sort of relevant. I'm also going to say where he's from. I'm also going to say the crimes that he committed, if we're talking to a criminal, and I'm going to, including this super high profile case that he was involved in. If you're saying all that, people can easily figure out who that person is. So you're not maintaining confidentiality even though you changed his name. So you want to make sure you write up the research so that you can't identify those participants based on the information that is given about them. And that sometimes means changing some things that aren't really all that relevant, like maybe the town or city that they're from, that might not be super relevant. But sometimes that also means you have an interview with 2 or 3 or 4 different people and you sort of amalgamate those into one person or one case, or you kind of switch up some of their specifics or whatever. So you have to do it you have to kind of be creative, but you want to do it in a way that is going to protect, again, the confidentiality of your participants so that people who know them won't be able to read this and recognize who you're talking about. And so it's important to keep in mind that the law does not recognize our ethical obligations as researchers to maintain those confidences. So even though there was that statement about our ethical obligations, it comes from AASC and ACJS, the law doesn't recognize that. So the law would say that if you are given a subpoena, you have to comply with that subpoena. And so that's something that, again, you have to know where your line is going to be. So then the last major ethical principle, sort of starting from our original list of 4, the protection of subjects, that's like the biggest one. So there's a lot to talk about there. But then the last one is the uses of research. So how we're using that research kind of after the fact. We have to consider how our research will be used, not necessarily by us, but by anybody. We have to think about how this research is going to be conducted, but then also how it's going to be used after the fact. So research, for example, conducted on behalf of an organization, you might have additional difficulties in terms of who controls the final report and whether or not it's made public. So if you're conducting research and your final results, you're being ethical, you're being honest and open, and they're like, well, that's great, but we don't really want to say this about, our company or these people who are our donors or whatever, then we're just going to not publish that. So it's great that you did that, but we're just going to put it in the file drawer. And so that is what happens, and that actually it has a term for it. It's called the file drawer effect, and that's when these undesirable results get buried. And sometimes this happens because it's saying the wrong thing, but also sometimes people don't want to publish research if they don't find any significant results. And so it's like, well, I made all these tests and nothing was significant. That is just as important to be publishing and making sure that people know that as if there were things that were found, but people don't, if there's nothing sexy and exciting to talk about some, these cool statistically significant findings, then they don't like to publish it. But that is information that still should be put out there. So we don't want that file drawer effect, whether it's because things are intentionally being buried or we just don't think we can get something published. We want everything out there that we can. And then we also have to remember that we can't withhold beneficial treatment. So you can't do a research study. You can't conduct, say, medical research where you were intentionally withholding something that we know is beneficial. Or, if there's a program in place for, helping drug users or something like that, and you want to test. So you can't intentionally take something away from them that we already know is beneficial. The only valid case is if we don't actually know if the treatment works and you're honestly doing your research to see if the treatment is better or not, because we don't know. And then sometimes you can also do this if there are limited resources and not everybody can get it anyways. So if it's, say, a medication that not everybody has access to, and so you only have so many to give out, then as long as you do it in a way we're maintaining that justice principle, that everything is evenly, risks and benefits are evenly distributed, and everybody has the same chance of getting good things versus bad things, then that's okay. But you can't intentionally withhold beneficial treatment. And I mean, the Tuskegee syphilis study, that's clearly, it breached that ethical principle when they withheld the penicillin from the people that had syphilis. So that is definitely something that if you know something is beneficial, you can't intentionally withhold that for the sake of your research. And so that's kind of how we can use research in an ethical way, and that's an important ethical principle.